AP review. This should be for Tuesday, Tuesday the 31st of March. So just a heads up on the calendar as well. I'm probably going to update it just because kind of going through this yesterday, I realized that some of these are going to be pretty long, so I might kind of stretch out the review sections a little bit. It really just depends on when we get the update for when the dates are for the WAP test from the College Board, which will be sometime next week. So hopefully that will kind of allow us to make a more flexible schedule. Or a little less work each night, but we'll see what happens. So today we're going to wrap up the classical era, right? The early American civilizations of the classical era. There are two to know about here. The first one is the city of Teotihuacan. Oops, I want that in that. Teotihuacan. So it's a city in central Mexico, right? Located near Mexico City. Just some quick key things here. Gridded street system, which shows some sort of government's organization. It's got some monumental architecture in the form of the temples that they have, right? The Sun Temple and Moon Temple. Okay. And then it's abandoned later on, but it will come up later when in being influenced, a big influence on the Aztec civilization. And then we have the Mayans, right, which are a little further south, more in Central America. They are very old, right, but they reached their high point between 250 and 900 CE. They have a very complex written language, right, the most complex up until this point, up until the point the Americans show up. Or the Europeans show up in the Americas, excuse me. They had the calendar, which if you know anything about that, the whole 2012 joke, the idea that the Mayan calendar ended in 2012, but it was very accurate, which helps kind of show that they probably understood astronomy to a bit as well. And then also the concept of zero, right? The mathematical concept of zero, which is a very big deal in terms of, understanding mathematics and in the world and things like that. Okay. So that was a quick little thing there. So last thing in the classical age is the comparisons, right? How they are similar, how they are different, right? All these different societies, right? So let's start with trade networks, right? So we start to see an expanse of trade networks during this era due to some innovations. Right. Specifically, they talked about horse stirrups, which allowed for easier travel along roads, which leads to the concept of more road networks, right? And then what else here? We have new sails, right? We have the lateen sails, right? The triangular shaped sails that helped for better navigation on the oceans. We have monsoon wind knowledge, right? That allowed them to kind of time out their explorations and voyages a little better, right? You could use the monsoon winds to get much quicker if you were on kind of the right side of the monsoon winds, right? Especially in the Indian Ocean, right? Almost exclusively, really, in the Indian Ocean, and then the camel saddle for beneficial trade along the Sahara, right? Let's see, what else here? I think that's about it for the major innovations of the trade networks, right? With our major trade networks being the Mediterranean, right? The Mediterranean trade network, especially for the Romans, but not just the Romans. The Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and then, of course, probably the biggest one to know about, the Silk Road trade network, which begins in the time period of the Romans and the Han Chinese, who would interact and trade along these networks. Okay, we have the decline of classical empires. Right, they shared a lot of similarities, right, amongst all these empires. Right. Okay. So They had a problem with tax collection over time. They could not necessarily collect taxes efficiently, which is very bad for a major government, especially for like the Romans, right? They could not collect enough taxes to keep their very large government going. We see a decline in trade over time as well in a lot of these societies, right? And especially what we're talking about here is going to be Rome and Han China as kind of the two major ones, with some other ones kind of thrown in there. So decline in trade also comes along with plague, right? The spread of plague, especially again in Rome and Han China, reduces populations, right? Which also leads to a decline in trade as well. Social conflict, social strife, social inequality, let's say. Social inequality leads to a lot of internal conflict, right, between the rich and the poor. Right, as the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. The poor start to kind of revolt against that. We have poor leadership, but the one I really want to focus on here is external pressures. Right, for Rome, right, it's the Huns pressuring the Germanic tribes into Rome. For the Han Chinese, it's the Xiongnu, leading to some issues there. Now, one thing that keeps these societies together, right, after the decline, is the one social cultural thing that keeps them all together is religion, right? Religion keeps societies together, not necessarily politically, but culturally, right? Specifically, they talk about Christianity in Europe. We see Confucianism in China. And then we see Hinduism and Buddhism in South Asia, specifically Hinduism more than Buddhism, as Buddhism is going to kind of see its way out here pretty soon in India, or South Asia, right, as we call it. Okay, so those things help keep them culturally similar and a little more unified post collapse of these massive societies, but yeah, they will continue to be pretty important in those areas for a very long time, and in some places for until the modern day, right? So post classical civilization. So this is the time period from 600 to 1200 CE, right, which will bring us up right to the beginning of the full curriculum. Okay. So let's see here. What do we want to talk about? So a couple key things here. Okay. We have some newly formed centralized states during this time period that we'll talk about here in a bit. Coming from new areas that we haven't talked about. But these new centralized states will also lead to an increase in trade and long distance trade specifically. And we have kind of the same networks as before, but also kind of like we kind of see the expansion of some new ones. Okay. Again, we have the Silk Roads reopen during this time period, especially under Muslim control. We have the Indian Ocean trade network, again, especially under Muslim control. And then we also see the Trans-Saharan trade network open up and become much more powerful, again, due to Muslim control, right? And so we see new technology spread as well, right? Specifically, we see the compass. Oops, that's not the color I want. Sorry. I want F4. The compass, the astrolabe, which helps, I believe, with latitude. Compass, astrolabe, credit, right? New forms of credit, which means, hey, you could spend money now that you don't necessarily have. Paper money from China, as well as the compass. And then new religions as well are going to come out of this. But of course, we also see, as we see with any trade networks, which frankly we're seeing today, we see the spread of new diseases, right? So, all right, let's get into it, and we're going to start with the definitively, not even close, the most important development of the post-classical era, and that is the development of Islam. Right. So this is right at the beginning of the section, right? Let's say the 7th century. The 7th century CE is when this begins. What we see here is it really spreads most particularly in the Middle East, comes out of the Arabian Peninsula from one man, Muhammad. Right, Muhammad living on the Arabian Peninsula will spread this religion. There's a lot. If you want to get into the details, you can go do that. But for our purposes, we're gonna kind of move on here. And his teachings are brought out in the holy book of Islam, the Quran. Right, they are spread along. They are spread by the people who follow the Quran, known as Muslims. Right, practicing the religion of Islam. Right. And that Muhammad is, Muhammad is in the line of the last great prophet. He is called the seal of the prophets. And he is in the same line as previous prophets, namely the Abrahamic line that we've talked about with Jews, Abraham, Moses, who was a Jewish prophet as well, who led the Jews out of Egypt. And then Jesus of Nazareth, who is, of course, the Christian prophet, right? Key components of Islam, right? So let's start with the 5 pillars of Islam. Let me redo that. 5 pillars of Islam, right? So the first one is belief in one God only, called Allah. The second one is the ritual prayer. The pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. Okay. The third part of this is the fasting during the month of Ramadan. Okay. The next one here is that you must give alms to the poor, right? Basically, give money or support to the poor. Might not necessarily be money. And then lastly, you must make a pilgrimage to Mecca once in your life. Okay, those are the 5 pillars of Islam, right? The key ideas of Islam. They create a law code based on the Quran, called Sharia law. So where Islam is a little bit different is that from Christianity, especially, and it's kind of the most direct comparison. Christianity does not have a law code in this sense. It does have the 10 Commandments, as is Judaism, but the 10 Commandments are not an actual law code in that sense, right? They're kind of just a list of things you shouldn't do. Where Sharia law is the interpretation of the Quran into a full-on religious and civic law code, right? Civil law being kind of not, just the general law. So this is a religious and civil law code, right? Whereas the 10 Commandments is more of a religious code, right? Like, hey, don't do these or you will be punished religiously, you'll be punished by God. So now we're going to talk about after Muhammad's death, we see a crisis in Islam, namely around who is to rule. And that will lead to the major split in Islam that is still very important to this day. And of course, the name for that person who rules, the title of that person who rules is Caliph or Caliph, right? That is the name of the ruler, right? So you have 2 groups who come out of this, right? You have the Sunni Muslims, right, who believed that it should be the kind of best leader, right, the caliph chosen from all candidates, all Muslim people. And then you have the Shia Muslims, or Shia Islam, right, who believe that it should be the caliph should come from Muhammad's bloodline. Okay. So that's the major split in Islam we see to this day. And so the Shia Muslims are mostly present in Iran and Iraq, whereas Sunni Muslims are a little more dominant around the rest of the world, right? So we see the expansion of Islam, despite this rift, right? We see the expansion of Islam into lots of different places from the Arabian Peninsula. We see it into the Middle East. We see it into North Africa. We see it into Spain, and then even into northern India, right? Or not even just northern India, it's also coastal southern India, right? So we see Islam expand pretty significantly throughout Asia and parts of Africa and Europe. And this area right here, we call the House of Islam, or Dar al-Islam. Right, that is the whole Muslim world is known as Dar al-Islam, and so, do we have enough space here? I don't think so. Let's go ahead and we'll cut this video here. All right, so now we're going to kind of talk about all the political developments of the era. If you want to look at a map, you can follow along in the book. The book has some pretty good maps at this point. So we're first off going to start with the Abbasid Caliphate. There are other caliphates, but this is without a doubt the most important one. The Abbasid Caliphate lasts from the 8th to the 13th century. So it does kind of fall into a chunk of it will fall into our actual, the actual curriculum. And I'm not saying this isn't part of the curriculum. They could ask questions on this. We're not sure. But this is the golden age of Islamic culture. Right, and again, a golden age kind of consists of two things usually. It's an economic and a cultural growth, right? So we see prosperous trade, right? They reestablished the Silk Roads along with China, along with the Tang Dynasty, reestablished the Silk Roads, right? We see also the growth of the Trans-Saharan trade network under the Abbasid Caliphate. And then also the Indian Ocean, right? They are kind of responsible for all three of these trade networks, right? The capital of the Abbasids and the most important city, without a doubt, in the realm is going to be the city of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq, right? We see Baghdad in particular becomes a center of learning, an educational bastion. Right, lots of important learning going on there. Specifically, they talk about medicine, astronomy, the development of algebra occurs in Baghdad. Right, the math of algebra. They also preserved Greek and Roman texts, which the Europeans, as we'll see later, were definitely not doing. So that's a big deal for going forward there, right? They have lots of religious toleration here, as long as you do one thing, which is pay the kind of religious tax known as the jizya, right? If you are a non-Muslim, you must pay the jizya tax, which actually does lead to a lot of people converting, right? And in terms of the role of women, there are some improvements by the Abbasid Caliphate. The improvements are they have property rights, right? They have more marriage and property rights. These are strengthened in relation to who came previously in these regions, right? They end female infanticide. But on the other side, they continue to practice the veiling of women. And then also polygamy, right? Where a man is allowed to have multiple wives. So it's better, but it is not great. It's not perfect for women within the Abbasid Caliphate. All right, let's make our way over to China. I should have made this blue, by the way. I apologize. I think that's a key term. In China, we have 3 dynasties to know about. We have the Sui dynasty, which lasts for all of like 30 years or so. They do not last very long, but they are very important because they unify China for the first time post-Han. For a few hundred years, it has been an era of conflict within China, so that's not been very good. But the most important thing, without a doubt, is the construction of the Grand Canal, right, which for the first time ever connects southern and northern China, especially the agricultural southern part. The southern part of China is where most of the rice is produced. Northern part is where a lot of wheat is produced. So we see the connection of northern and southern China for the first time, which culturally and economically is a huge, huge deal. So that's what they do, but they're very similar to the Qin in that they are very, very mean. And so pretty much as soon as the first ruler, Sui Yongdi, dies, his dynasty kind of dies with him. The Tang dynasty, however, is very important, and it will last quite a long time, from the 7th to the 10th century. Okay. They expand into Vietnam, Southeast Asia, into Mongolia, north, and then into Central Asia to the west. So really expansive empire here. One of the key things here is the development of champa rice, this fast ripening rice, which leads to a massive population boom under the Tang Dynasty, right? And so they expanded the civil service exam and the bureaucracy, right? They expand the, I'm going to shorten it to CSE, the civil service exam, which, if you recall, is a bastion of Confucianist thought, which also expands the bureaucracy. They also invented, during this time period, gunpowder. Right? Not necessarily using it for guns at this point, but you know where it's going to be used. Gunpowder and paper money. Right, 2 major innovations that have a massive impact to this day, right? They also exported a lot of 2 goods in particular, which made them very wealthy: silk and porcelain, kind of becoming the 2 major export goods of the time, which made them, very wealthy. And especially led to the expansion of the Silk Roads, right, or the revitalization of the Silk Roads. They call it the Second Golden Age of the Silk Roads, which will last for most of the Tang and Song dynasties and into the Mongolian dynasties as well, right? Another thing they do is the expansion of the tributary system. So the tributary system is the system by which the Chinese government demands tribute from their neighbors, especially 3 regions. Well, let's say, two or three regions. Japan, less so, but Korea and Southeast Asia or Vietnam, right? And they base this on the concept of China as the Middle Kingdom, right, which is this idea that China is kind of above the rest of the world in terms of its relation with the heavens, and then also kind of being the cultural center of the world, right? So they expand the tributary system again into mostly Korea, Vietnam, and to a lesser extent Japan, right? And as we've talked about previously, Korea really likes the tributary system. Vietnam hates it. Japan is kind of in the middle. But they'll eventually break free of it. So we see them decline due to peasant uprisings. Right, that old land distribution issue, and external invasions leads to a collapse of the Tang Dynasty, which leads us into our final Chinese dynasty of the era, which is the Song Dynasty, which will last from the 10th century until the 13th century. Okay. So we see an expansion of the bureaucracy again, which leads to more social mobility. Right. This is probably the time point where the bureaucracy is the biggest. They have a huge bureaucracy under the Song, almost too big. Some people would probably say. They become the leading manufacturers of things like iron and steel during this time period. As well as, of course, the go-tos of silk and porcelain, right? They also create a new philosophy of Neo-Confucianism, which is a blend of Confucianism, Confucian kind of social structure ideas, right? Confucian ideas plus Buddhist spirituality, right? Plus a little bit of Taoist spirituality as well, are in Neo-Confucianism. And this will become the pretty dominant philosophy of the next era, right? And is during this time we see the exportation of the compass and gunpowder and paper money, to the rest of the world. Okay. All right. Japan. Okay, so in Japan, what we see is a golden age from 800 to 1200, from the 9th to the 13th centuries, okay, under their imperial situation. Especially in painting and literature is where we see this golden age occur in. Right, this is where the famous novel *The Tale of Genji* is produced. However, by the end of the 13th century, we start to see local landlords called the daimyo start to erode the emperor's power. Right, and so what we see here, we see an increase in warfare during this time period, and so the daimyo eventually kind of take power. So the daimyo towards the end of this period defeat the emperor and impose a new type of ruler called the shogun, which is a military ruler. If you recall, the military government of Japan is called the bakufu, but the shogun doesn't have too much power. We see a heavily decentralized structure. Decentralized political structure here, we would actually eventually call feudalism, which we're going to talk about when we talk about Europe a little bit more. Okay, so you see this decentralized political structure known as feudalism, and then we have the kind of warrior culture of the samurai as the major fighters in this kind of decentralized world where everybody's kind of fighting each other. We also have a pretty rigid hierarchy, rigid social structure as well, where the daimyo, the shogun, the daimyo, and the samurai all kind of are at the top, and then peasants and merchants are below them, merchants being at the bottom. It's kind of the key component of this social structure. Right, which is unique to East Asia, where China also sees merchants at the bottom because they don't see them producing anything. They see them kind of just as a burden on society. The official religion of Japan is Shinto. Right, that is the religion at this time, which is composed of two key concepts: the veneration of ancestors, and also the worship of nature spirits. right? However, we do see the importation of Buddhism into China, and eventually Buddhism will kind of overshadow Shinto, right? So we see more of a blend of the two, but over time we will see Buddhism kind of take hold in Japan. Okay, moving on to Africa. For the first time, we're really talking about the sub-Saharan African societies. So from 600 to 1200, we have chiefdoms, what we've called previously kin-based societies, right, where these kind of family-based systems are there. We don't really have a full government in a lot of places. There's a lack of a kind of central government in almost all of Africa for now, right? So we see the key thing that keeps it's a very diverse cultural area, Africa, lots of different cultures, but there are some cultural similarities, specifically due to the Bantu migrations, right? So the Bantu migrated out of West Africa due to population pressures throughout the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, right? And so they spread the Bantu language. They spread agricultural techniques, right? Just the idea of farming they spread, right? And then lastly, they spread ironworking as well. So kind of the three key traits that we see in most African societies right here all come from the Bantu. And then by 1000 CE, we start to see the development of complex government systems, specifically in West Africa. Okay. So what we see here is, so we see this complex government, but then we also see that combined with the Trans-Saharan trade network to create pretty strong government structures here, specifically the Kingdom of Ghana. Okay, so the Kingdom of Ghana lasts for about 500 years from 700 to 1240. Their control of the Trans-Saharan trade route allowed them to get quite wealthy, especially by taxing gold and salt trade. Right, that's how they made their wealth and their power. Right. The other key thing here is that Ghana develops the first Muslim religion. Islam is imported across the trade network, right? And so they become part of Dar al-Islam, right? And so we see they convert to the religion. On the East Coast, right? The Indian Ocean trade network, right, leads to a growth of some pretty economically successful societies known as the Swahili Coast. Right, Swahili being a mixture of Arabic and Bantu languages. Right. So we see them connected through this trade network to become very powerful. These are a collection of city-states where all these cities kind of control trade throughout the Indian Ocean. And then lastly, what we want to talk about here is one kind of large government that kind of created in central southern Africa. That is Great Zimbabwe. Okay, so Great Zimbabwe is created. They are there to control trade. Right, they control trade to the Swahili Coast. And what they are known for is their large kind of stone structures, right, known as the Zimbabwe, which are like these kind of living areas for the ruling class, right? They declined in the 15th century. Nobody really knows why. The guess is economic decline due to the decline of gold mines in the region. Okay. All right, so moving on. Let's see if we can get the rest of this on. No, we might be able to get the rest of this on here. Let's give it a shot. Next up is going to be South and Southeast Asia. South Asia being India and Pakistan. Southeast Asia being Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, those kind of places, right? So in South Asia, in India, post-Gupta, we see massive decentralization. And that's going to kind of be the theme of India, right? There's going to be a lack of unity in India for a very long time. However, they don't really need political unification because Hinduism really keeps a lot of that area unified. Keeps society strong as well, right? Because it's such a rigid system that people follow the rules of Hinduism without necessarily needing a larger political system to do so, right? Especially in southern India. However, in northern India, we see a series of invasions cause a lot of havoc there, especially invasions that lead to the institution of Islam coming into the subcontinent, right? We do see trade in the Indian Ocean flourish, in India benefiting quite a lot from that, right? With Indian Ocean trade growing, Indian Ocean trade leads to economic growth, especially in southern India, right? The monsoon winds and stuff really help that. They talk about a bunch of different goods. I'm not too worried about that. So we see that this Indian Ocean trade network also allows for the spread of the religions out of South Asia, Buddhism and Hinduism in particular, and then eventually Islam. Right, Islam will also make its way around the Indian Ocean trade networks from India and into India, right, and especially into Southeast Asia. Okay, so the reason that Southeast Asia is here is that Southeast Asia is greatly impacted by South Asian culture as they're spread by. As the culture is spread by the merchants and missionaries, right? We see things like on the mainland, right? We see things like Angkor Wat kind of display that with its mixture of Buddhist and Hindu architecture. We see the use of the terms like Raja in Southeast Asia, right? But in particular, we see Islam spread on the Spice Islands on the Malay Peninsula in modern-day Indonesia, right, and the area known as Malacca, right. So there is South and Southeast Asia very briefly. Okay, Europe. Well, Europe's in a bit of a pickle here. So we see in Western Europe. Right, Western Europe is heavily decentralized during this era due to the political vacuum left by the Romans, right? And on top of this, we also see invasions by the Vikings cause a lot of stress in the region, right? So that causes a lot of issues as well, but also brings them into the cultural exchanges, right? So we see the creation of lots of individual states that they call duchies and fiefdoms. So the other thing here is that because there's no centralization, there's a lack of strong trade due to the political decentralization. Right, it's too dangerous, essentially, to trade in Western Europe because of that lack of political centralization. And then it also a lack of long-distance trade as well, because they are not able to trade with the Muslim trade networks due to geographic distance, but also because of some biases there, right? But the key thing that keeps Western Europe together is Christianity, right? Christianity unifies Western Europe pretty significantly. It kind of keeps, honestly, it keeps everything together where political systems do not. And so, a kind of example of this is that in 800, the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, Christian Church, excuse me, crowns a guy by the name of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, right, in an attempt to kind of create some political stability through religious power, right? And so he's a French king, and he does unify modern France and honestly large parts of modern Western Europe. But when he dies, that kind of breaks off under him. But it does not. Christianity does unify all of Europe, but not after the year 1054, where we see the schism. Oops, let me get that little S here. Schism between Western and Eastern European Christianity, right? And so what we see created here are the two kind of major sects of Christianity. In the West, you have the Roman Catholic Church, and in the East, you have the Eastern Orthodox Church. Okay. All right. We then also see in the 11th century, about 50 years after this, we see the Crusades called by the Pope to free Jerusalem, right, from Muslim control. That is the goal here. They mostly fail. However, what this does have a positive side effect, in that it increases long distance trade, specifically with Dar al-Islam. Right, we see a lot more trade with the Muslim world between the Christians and the Muslims, and then also starts to see technological advances due to this. Right, especially when it comes to the return of Aristotle and Socrates and Plato to European hands. Right, they start to interact more with their own history there. Right, and so lastly here, the Americas. We see the Mayans end around 900 due to environmental problems. The soils degrading below them, probably because they did not have proper agricultural techniques, drought, and war all kind of combined. We still see some of those cities inhabited. So we see two new cultures kind of develop during this time period. One we're going to call the Mississippian culture, which is based along the Mississippi River. In North America, right? The Mississippian culture, with its major trade city of Cahokia, right, in the Ohio River Valley, it becomes larger than London, which I didn't really know about. That's pretty crazy. They kind of create a massive trade network along the Mississippi River and Ohio River valleys, right? So they kind of help unify a little bit of North America. And then the last one to talk about here is the Toltecs, who kind of take the realm of Teotihuacan, right? They adopt Mayan religion, so they're heavily influenced by the Mayans, right? And then they will later greatly influence the Aztecs. And that is it for the prologue section. So on this next one, we're going to start getting into kind of the key things. But I guess one thing we do want to do real quick is kind of take a look at the world as it stands at 1200 as we are getting into this last section, or this section of the official curriculum. Right, kind of good idea to kind of get a good starting point here, right? So we see massive trade networks, right? So we see the Silk Road. We see the Trans-Saharan, and we see the Indian Ocean trade network. All right, we see all these three connecting parts of Asia, Europe, and Africa into a one kind of hemispheric trade network, which is going to be very important for technological spread, plague spread, those kind of things. The Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines, and the Muslim empires create stability in the Middle East. Right. We see China and Dar al-Islam as kind of the major centers of learning, major centers of technology. Let's just say centers of technology. I think that's pretty crucial, right, for right now. Obviously, it's going to change here. We see Western Europe and Japan sharing feudal ideas, have feudal decentralized structures, right, which also kind of contributes to their technological backwardsness compared to China and Dar al-Islam, right? It just creates more inconsistency and stuff like that, right? We have stateless societies in Africa, in most of Africa. We shouldn't say all of Africa. There are some exceptions to that rule, specifically in West and East Africa. West Africa with what we'll see is Mali, and East Africa with the Swahili Coast, specifically where they are part of Dar al-Islam, right? The areas that are Muslim have a little bit more stability, right? And then lastly, we're going to see that Afro-Eurasia, the massive multi-continent Africa, Europe, and Asia, the Americas, and then the parts of Oceania are all isolated from one another, and that is going to change somewhat quickly here, and that's going to bring about some big changes, right? So 1200 is a really cool year or a really cool time, because this is all going to change pretty quickly here, especially with the rise of the Mongols. And so we'll start to get into that in the next one, and I will see you later.